I left that night with $318 folded in my coat pocket and a promise I made to no one but myself. At my daughter's engagement party, in a house bigger than any building I'd ever worked in, my son-in-law raised his glass and told 40 strangers that I was the reason his fiancé used to be ashamed to bring people home. The room laughed. My daughter didn't look up from her plate. 11 years later, I walked back through that same front door, carrying a folder that would end everything he'd built. Before we start, I want to say something to every son, every daughter, every parent watching tonight, because I read every comment, I answer what I can, and I want to know where you're from. Tell me your city. Tell me your state. I'll be there in the comments after this. Some names in this story have been changed. Some details are shaped for privacy. But what happened to me, and what I built afterward, is as true as anything I've ever told you. My name is Walter Hensley. I was 61 years old the night my life split into a before and an after, though I wouldn't understand the shape of that split for a long time. I'd spent 32 years as a machinist, and then a plant floor supervisor at a company that made hydraulic couplings for agricultural equipment out of a town called Marion, Ohio, that most people couldn't find on a map. I raised my daughter Renee alone after her mother passed when Renee was 9. I packed her lunches. I sat through parent-teacher conferences in my work boots because I never had time to go home and change. I put her through state college on overtime pay and a second job doing small engine repair out of my garage on weekends. She became a corporate attorney. I was proud of her in a way that didn't have words, the kind of pride that sits behind your ribs and doesn't need saying out loud because I figured she already knew. Renee got engaged to a man named Preston Callahan when she was 31. He came from money the way some people come from a certain climate, so naturally they don't notice it anymore. His family owned a chain of boutique hotels along the East Coast, and Preston himself ran acquisitions for the company, which, as far as I could tell, meant he flew places and had lunches and came home with deals. I met him twice before the engagement party, both times for under an hour, both times with him checking his watch before we'd finished our coffee. I told myself, that's just how important people move through the world. I told myself a lot of things that year. The engagement party was at the Callahan family's summer property outside Newport, Rhode Island, a stone house on 11 acres with a lawn that rolled down to the water like it had been poured rather than grown. I drove 12 hours from Marion because I don't fly, never have, never trusted the idea of it, and I wasn't about to start for an occasion like this. I wore the one suit I owned, charcoal gray, bought for Renee's mother's funeral 14 years earlier, and let out once at the waist. I brought a bottle of the good bourbon I'd been saving, a gift for Preston's father, because I didn't know what else you brought to a house like that. I remember standing in the driveway looking up at the place and feeling something I hadn't expected to feel, which was smaller than I usually let myself feel. Renee met me at the door. She hugged me the way she used to when she was small, quick and tight, and for a second I thought the night was going to be fine. "Dad," she said, "you found it okay?" "I found it," I said. "Big place." She laughed, a little nervous. "Preston's family," she said. Like that explained the size of the house and also, somehow, apologized for it. Inside there were maybe 70 people. Caterers moving through them with trays, a string quartet in the corner playing something I didn't recognize, and a bar longer than my kitchen back home. I didn't know anyone. I found a spot near the fireplace and nursed a glass of wine I didn't particularly want, and I watched my daughter move through the room like she'd been born into it, laughing at things, touching people's arms, glowing in a way I hadn't seen since she was a girl bringing home a report card. I told myself that glow was worth every hour I'd spent on that factory floor. I still believe that, for what it's worth. I just didn't yet know what the night was going to cost. Preston found me around 8, his arm already loose around Renee's waist, his face already pink from champagne. "Walter," he said, "my father-in-law, the working man." He said working man the way some people say something in a language they find charming but don't actually speak. I shook his hand. "Good to see you again," I said. He turned to the small cluster of people near us, men in blazers with no ties, women with the kind of jewelry that doesn't clatter because it's too expensive to clatter, and he said, "Walter here spent his whole career in a factory. Fixing pumps, was it?" "Couplings," I said. "Hydraulic couplings." "Right," he said, and something in his mouth twitched like he was suppressing a laugh at a word he found funny for reasons that had nothing to do with the word itself. Someone tapped a knife against a glass, and the room went quiet, and I understood we'd reached the part of the evening where people say things about the happy couple. Preston's father spoke first, a tall, silver-haired man named Grantham Callahan, and he was gracious in the practiced way of someone who has given 100 toasts and never once meant every word of one. Then Preston took the glass and the small microphone someone handed him, and he thanked his parents, thanked God, thanked several business associates by name, and then he said he wanted to say something about Renee's family too. Because family matters, doesn't it? And the room murmured its agreement. He said, "When I met Renee's father here, Walter, I have to be honest, I understood something about Renee I hadn't understood before." He gestured toward me with his glass, and every head in the room turned, and I felt my whole body go still, the way it used to go still on the floor when a machine started making a sound it shouldn't make. "Renee never talked much about growing up," he said. "Took me almost a year to get out of her that her dad worked in a factory her whole childhood. I used to wonder why she was so quiet about where she came from. Now I understand. There's no shame in honest work," he said, and he smiled like the sentence that followed wasn't going to contradict the one he'd just said. "But there's also no mystery why a girl grows up wanting more than grease under her nails and a house that smells like a garage. Walter gave Renee a lot of things. Elbow grease, determination." He paused, and the room was already laughing. That low, warm ripple of laughter that people do at a party when they're not sure if they're supposed to, but the host has given them permission. "What he didn't give her," Preston said, "was any idea of what a real life could look like. That's all right, Walter. She found her way here anyway." The laughter got louder. I looked for Renee. She was 3 feet from her fiancé, holding her champagne glass with both hands, and she was looking down at the floor, and her shoulders had that particular set to them, that particular tightness, that I recognized instantly because I'd seen my late wife hold her shoulders exactly that way when she was choosing not to say something. Renee wasn't embarrassed for me. She was relieved it was over. I understood that in the space of maybe 2 seconds, the way you understand a fracture in a casting before you can even articulate what's wrong with it, just a wrongness in the weight of the thing. My daughter had heard this before. Maybe not these exact words, but this exact shape of feeling. And some small, terrible part of her was glad Preston had finally said it out loud, so she didn't have to keep managing the gap between where she came from and where she'd arrived. I didn't make a scene. I want you to understand that about me before this story goes any further, because I know some of you are the type who'd have thrown the drink, and I respect that, I do, but that was never going to be me. I set my glass down on the mantel, next to a photograph of Preston, at what looked like a regatta, and I found the coat check girl, and I got my jacket, and I walked out the front door into the Rhode Island night with the sound of the string quartet still drifting out through the open windows behind me. Renee caught me in the driveway. "Dad," she said. "Wait." I turned around. She was still holding her glass, like she'd walked out here on instinct before remembering she was holding it. "I'm sorry," she said. He'd had a lot to drink. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. "I want to ask you something," I said, "and I need you to actually answer it. Are you ashamed of me?" She didn't answer fast enough. That was the answer. "Dad," she started. "It's not that simple," and I said, "It's the simplest question I've ever asked you, Renee, and you couldn't say no in under 3 seconds. I got in my truck." She stood in the driveway in her nice dress with her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, and I remember looking at her in the rearview mirror as I pulled away, small and lit up by the porch light. And I remember thinking that I was looking at a person I had built with my own hands and somehow lost anyway, the way you can build something perfectly and still watch it corrode from the inside where you can't see it happening. I counted my cash at a gas station 40 miles later. $318. Not because I was broke. Understand. I had savings, a pension, a paid-off house back in Marion. But that's what was in my wallet that night. And something about the specific number felt important enough to remember, the way you remember the reading on a gauge right before something breaks. I sat in that gas station parking lot for 20 minutes with the engine running, and I made myself a promise, which was this. I was never again going to be a man that other people got to define. Not Preston, not anyone. Whatever came next, I would decide what my life had meant, not them. I drove the 12 hours home in silence, no radio, and by the time I pulled into my driveway in Marion, the sun was coming up, And I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and I thought about my 32 years on that floor, and I thought about the thing Preston clearly didn't know, which was that I hadn't just tightened bolts. In my last 11 years at the plant, I'd run the entire quality engineering division. I held 2 patents, filed jointly with the company, for a coupling seal design that had, by conservative estimate, saved the agricultural equipment industry hundreds of millions of dollars in field failures. I had a master's degree in mechanical engineering that I'd earned at night, 3 classes a semester for 6 years, after Renee went to sleep, because I never wanted anyone to be able to say I hadn't tried. Preston didn't know any of that because he'd never once asked me a single question about my work that wasn't designed to be answered with a joke. I didn't call Renee for 4 months. She called me 11 times in that stretch, according to my phone, and left messages I couldn't bring myself to listen to past the first 10 seconds, because I could hear in her voice that she wanted to explain rather than apologize, and I wasn't ready for an explanation. I wanted an apology, plain and whole, and I have learned since that wanting a thing and receiving it are 2 entirely separate outcomes that don't always meet in the middle. What I did instead, in those 4 months, was retire early from the plant, take the buyout they'd been offering senior staff for 2 years, and enroll in something I'd wanted to do since I was 30 years old and never had the time for. A forensic engineering certification, the kind used in litigation, product liability cases, insurance fraud investigations, corporate due diligence. I was good at machines. It turned out I was equally good at figuring out when someone was lying about a machine, or lying using a machine, which, as I would come to learn, was most of what corporate fraud actually was underneath the spreadsheets. I finished the certification in 14 months, faster than anyone in my cohort, most of whom were half my age. I want to tell you honestly that I did not do any of this with a plan for revenge in mind. I did it because I needed something to do with my hands and my mind that had nothing to do with the Callahans, and because for the first time in my adult life, I had no one depending on me and no factory floor demanding my hours, and I discovered that I liked learning. I liked it the way I imagine some people like retirement, travel, or golf. I built a small consulting practice, mostly insurance companies and manufacturing firms who needed someone to determine whether an equipment failure was mechanical, human, or fraudulent. I was good at it. Within 3 years, I had more work than I could take, and I was choosing clients instead of chasing them. Renee and I found our way back to something during those years, slower than either of us wanted, but real. She left Preston 18 months after the engagement party, before the wedding ever happened, for reasons that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with things I only learned about later. She moved to Columbus, took a position at a mid-sized firm instead of the corporate track she'd been on, and she called me every Sunday, without fail, for years. We didn't talk about that night at the summer house, not for a long time. Some wounds you let scar over before you go poking at them again, and I understood that about my daughter because I understood it about myself. It was Renee, actually, who first mentioned Meridian Hospitality Group to me 7 years after that party. She'd stayed loosely connected to people from that world, the way you do, and she mentioned over the phone one Sunday that Preston's family company was going public, a public stock offering, biggest thing to happen to a boutique hospitality brand in a decade, all over the trade press. I didn't think much of it at the time. Preston had become, to me, a closed door I'd stopped standing in front of. Then, 4 years after that, I got a call that changed the shape of everything. It came through my consulting firm, not from anyone I knew personally. An insurance syndicate that underwrote commercial property policies for hospitality companies needed an independent forensic review of maintenance records and safety compliance documentation across a portfolio of properties ahead of a major refinancing. Standard work. I did 4 or 5 of these a year. I didn't recognize the client name on the intake sheet because it was routed through a holding entity, the way these things often are. It wasn't until I was 3 days into the document review, cross-referencing elevator maintenance logs against actual service records, that I saw the name Meridian Hospitality Group buried in a subsidiary list, and beneath that, halfway down a signature page, the name Preston Callahan, Chief Operating Officer. I sat with that for a long moment. I could have recused myself. Any ethical consultant would have at least considered it. Instead, I called Margaret Oyeleren, an attorney I'd worked alongside for 6 years on prior litigation support, Someone I trusted with my professional reputation, the way you trust very few people, and I told her everything. The old history, the party, all of it. She was quiet for a while, and then she said, "Walter, if you find something real in there, this could look like a conflict of interest that sinks the whole case unless we handle it exactly right." I said, "Then tell me how to handle it right, because I already know what I'm going to find." Call it instinct. Call it 32 years of learning how things fail before they fail. I already knew. It took me 6 weeks of careful, documented, above-board work to confirm it. Meridian Hospitality Group had been falsifying elevator and fire suppression maintenance records across 11 properties for at least 4 years, cutting corners on inspections that cost real money and reporting them as completed to satisfy insurance and municipal requirements. Not a paperwork oversight, a deliberate, systemic pattern, and the signature authorizing the reduced inspection budget every single year, 4 years running, was Preston Callahan's. People had been staying in those hotels. Families, children. One incident, at a property outside Charleston, had already resulted in an elevator failure that injured 3 guests, quietly settled, quietly buried, 2 years before I ever opened that file. I brought everything to Margaret with full documentation, chain of custody intact, every finding independently verifiable, nothing built on inference or old grievance, because I knew, better than anyone, that if this was ever going to matter, it had to be unimpeachable. She filed it as what it was, a mandatory disclosure to the insurance syndicate, who in turn had a fiduciary and legal obligation to disclose material safety fraud to regulators before underwriting the refinancing. I didn't sue anyone. I didn't call a reporter. I let the system that already existed do what it was built to do, once someone finally handed it the truth instead of a falsified log. Meridian's refinancing collapsed within 3 weeks of the disclosure. The insurance syndicate dropped the account entirely, which triggered default clauses in nearly every other financing agreement the company held, because that's how leveraged debt works. One thread pulls the whole coat apart. Preston was placed on administrative leave within the month, pending an internal and now a state regulatory investigation into the falsified inspection records. His father's board voted him out of his COO position 11 weeks after that, not out of loyalty to the truth, understand, but because keeping him was now a liability the family couldn't absorb. The wedding, that never was, became the least interesting thing anyone in that family had ever done, and the world that had laughed so easily at a machinist in a charcoal suit spent the next year in depositions instead. I never spoke publicly about my role. I didn't need to. Margaret handled the disclosure the way disclosures are supposed to be handled, quietly, through proper channels, evidence speaking for itself without my name attached to any headline. But Renee knew. I told her everything, start to finish, the night before I filed, because she deserved to hear it from me before she heard it from anywhere else. And I remember she was quiet on the phone for a long time, and then she said, "Dad, you could have told me years ago you were working near his company." I said, "I didn't go looking for it, Renee. It found me. And when it did, I did what was right, not what would have felt good. There's a difference, and it took me most of my life to understand it." 11 years after that engagement party, almost to the week, I drove back to Newport, not to the summer house, to a small conference room at a regional bank branch, because Renee, of all things, was closing on her first home purchase in Columbus, a modest 3-bedroom she'd bought entirely on her own attorney's salary, no help from anyone, and she'd asked me to be there. On the way, I chose to drive past the old Callahan property, just once, because some part of me needed to see it. The gate was still there. The lawn had gone a little wild at the edges, untended, the way a place looks when the money that used to maintain the appearance of a thing has quietly moved on to appearances elsewhere. I didn't go in. I didn't need to. I sat in my truck at the end of that long driveway for maybe 3 minutes, and I thought about the man who'd stood in that house 11 years earlier holding a glass of wine he didn't want, listening to a room laugh at the idea that grease under a man's nails meant there was nothing worth knowing underneath it. I thought about how wrong that room had been, not because I'd gotten rich, though the consulting practice had done well, better than I ever expected, but because they'd mistaken quiet for empty. They'd mistaken a man who didn't need the room's approval for a man who had nothing to offer it. I drove on to Columbus. I stood next to my daughter in a small office while she signed papers for a house that was entirely, completely her own, built on her own name and her own work, no family money attached to a single line of it. And when she finished signing, she looked up at me and she said, "Dad, I want you to know something. I'm not ashamed of where I came from. I haven't been for a long time. I just didn't know how to say that out loud back then, in that house, in front of those people. I know," I told her. "I know now." And that was enough. It didn't need to be more than that. I'm 62 now, and I still take the occasional forensic case, mostly because I like the work, not because I need the money. I spend most of my time in Marion, in the house I raised Renee in, and most Sundays I drive to Columbus for dinner with her, and these days, with the man she's engaged to now, a high school shop teacher named Daniel, who once asked me, completely unprompted, what it was actually like to run a quality engineering division for 3 decades, and then sat and listened to my answer for 45 minutes, without checking his phone once. I noticed that. I notice things like that now. I think I always did, honestly. It just took a long time, and a very expensive house in Rhode Island, to teach me how much they mattered. If there's one thing this whole stretch of my life taught me, it's that patience isn't the absence of anger. It's what anger looks like when it decides to become useful instead of loud. I didn't walk back into Preston Callahan's life to destroy it. I walked back in because the truth was already there waiting, and I was simply the man standing closest to it when it finally needed telling. You do not have to force a broken thing to break. You only have to be paying attention when the pressure finally finds the fault it was always going to find. And then you have to be willing to do the harder thing, which is to act on what you find honestly, carefully, without spite, even when spite would feel like the easier fuel. If you've ever sat at a table and watched someone you love go quiet instead of standing up for you, I want you to know I understand that particular silence better than almost anything else in my life. It doesn't mean they don't love you. Sometimes it just means they haven't yet found the courage that loving you out loud requires. And sometimes, if you're patient, and if you're honest with them, the way I eventually was honest with Renee, that courage arrives late, but it arrives whole. Don't spend 11 years the way I did, waiting in silence for a fraud file to land on your desk by accident. Document what matters. Speak to someone you trust. Start the process of reclaiming your name today, not because you're owed revenge, but because silence is not the same thing as dignity, no matter how many rooms full of expensive people try to convince you otherwise. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. I mean that. I read every single comment, every city, every state, and I answer as many as I can before I go to bed. If this story found something true in you, if you've ever had a room decide who you were before you got the chance to tell them yourself, share it with someone who needs to hear that the room is always wrong before it's ever right. And if you believe, the way I've come to believe, that real love doesn't require you to disappear yourself to make someone else comfortable, then stay with me. There are more stories like this one, and I intend to keep telling them, one patient truth at a time, for as long as any of you are willing to listen.